The true measure of a legacy is not found in buildings of steel and glass or in lines of text in journals. It is found in the living, breathing actions of those who come after. Dr. Sarah Chen never sought to become a legend. She never asked for her name to be spoken with reverence at universities worldwide. She simply appeared each day and performed her work to a standard she set for herself, a standard that existed on a plane most could never reach. Her influence wasn't in a single dramatic moment of vindication, but in the slow, steady cultural shift that followed. Architects became better listeners. Young designers felt empowered to speak up. The entire profession, in its own incremental way, began valuing quiet professionalism as much as celebrated genius. The story of the silent architect became a foundational narrative for new graduates, a touchstone used to teach the core values of the profession: integrity, responsibility, and excellence in all things. It was a reminder that true authority isn't claimed with credentials or confidence. It is granted in the silent, astonished respect of those who witness undeniable skill. It is not found on a business card or a nameplate, but in the steady, practiced hands that can save a structure and the lives within it from certain disaster. Legacy isn't about what you accomplish for yourself. It's about the standards you inspire in others. It's about the lessons that live on long after your last project is complete. Dr. Chen never sought respect. She simply possessed a professional gravity so immense that respect was the only possible response. Her silence was never weakness. It was the calm at the center of a storm, the quiet confidence of a master who had nothing left to prove. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent action defines true excellence, subscribe to The Final Watch. I need to speak with the lead architect. The actual architect. The words carried the unmistakable arrogance of someone who had never been truly humbled. Senior partner Marcus Blackwell stood in the center of the design studio, arms crossed, his Italian suit impeccably tailored, his silver cufflinks catching the overhead lights. He was flanked by two junior partners from his firm, both mirroring his posture and his contemptuous smirk, eager to absorb the reflected glory of their mentor. The open-plan office fell into an uncomfortable silence. Designers and junior architects exchanged nervous glances between the imperious visitor and the woman he was addressing. She hadn't looked up. She remained focused on the large digital tablet before her, her brow furrowed as she swiped through complex structural calculations and load-bearing specifications. Her clothing was simple: dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and worn sneakers that had seen countless site visits. No designer labels. No flashy accessories, just a simple ID badge that read Chen. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the subtle lines around her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights spent perfecting impossible designs. Blackwell interpreted her silence as disrespect. "Miss," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this is the Zenith Tower, a $3 billion mixed-use development. I appreciate the drafting team's efforts, but my partners and I are here for the final design review with the decision makers. So if you could please find whoever is actually in charge, someone with credentials instead of a stylist, we can begin this meeting properly." A few of the junior partners chuckled. The designers looked at each other uneasily. They knew exactly who she was, but it wasn't their place to correct a celebrated architect whose firm had designed landmarks across 3 continents. They simply returned to their screens, leaving her isolated in the bubble of Blackwell's contempt. But in a corner office, 3 floors above, watching through the building's security feed, CEO Jonathan Reeves leaned closer to his monitor. He observed the way she held the tablet, not with the casual grip of a technician, but with the assured possession of a master examining her life's work. He noted the way her weight was balanced, grounded yet ready, an engineer's posture that understood the physics of stability. And he saw the profound, unshakable calm that surrounded her like an invisible force field, absorbing Blackwell's noisy arrogance and rendering it powerless. Reeves knew the studio was about to become a classroom, and a painful lesson was about to be taught. If you believe that true mastery is demonstrated through action rather than proclamation, subscribe to The Final Watch for more stories where quiet competence defeats loud arrogance. Dr. Sarah Chen made a final notation on her tablet, her finger tracing a complex stress analysis that mapped the structural integrity of the experimental building design before her. She didn't acknowledge Blackwell's escalating impatience. To do so would be to validate it, to admit that his frantic energy had any bearing on the meticulous life-or-death calculations of architectural safety. The studio air was thick with the scent of fresh blueprint paper, coffee, and the ozone smell of multiple computers running complex simulations, a sterile perfume she had come to associate with the razor's edge of architectural innovation. The Zenith Tower model itself was less a building and more a sculpture of impossible geometry. Its design featured a twisted crystalline structure that seemed to defy gravity, with cantilevered sections that extended outward at angles that made traditional architects uncomfortable. The exterior was designed with adaptive glass panels that could shift opacity and angle based on sunlight and weather conditions. It was meant to be the tallest structure in the Western Hemisphere, a monument that would redefine what was architecturally possible. It demanded a mind of exceptional capability. Blackwell, unable to tolerate being ignored, stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I'm the lead consultant for this project. That means this multi-billion-dollar structure," he said, gesturing dismissively at the holographic model, "falls under my firm's expertise. My team has been in this industry for decades. We've designed buildings on 4 continents. We're not going to have our final review delayed because some junior CAD operator is rechecking the elevator specifications." He squinted at her ID badge. "Chen, is that it? Well, Chen, the professionals are here now. Why don't you fetch us some coffee and let the real architects handle the important work?" The insult was so direct, so saturated with sexist and ageist prejudice that even his own partners shifted uncomfortably. The studio manager, a veteran with 40 years in the industry, made a move to intervene, his face darkening with indignation, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of the head from Chen stopped him cold. She finally looked up from her tablet. Her eyes, a deep brown that seemed to hold infinite depth, met Blackwell's for the first time. They were utterly devoid of emotion. Not anger, not fear, not indignation. It was the calm, analytical gaze of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. She offered no defense, no explanation, no protest. She simply tapped a final confirmation on her screen, and the tablet chimed softly. "Structural analysis complete," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. "All load calculations verified. The presentation is ready for you, Mr. Blackwell." Her complete lack of reaction was more unnerving than any shouted retort could have been. It was a silence that held a mirror to his own insecurity. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered across his face before his arrogance reasserted itself. He scoffed, turning away and striding toward the presentation theater as if he had won a great victory. "About time," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see if this design can withstand actual professional scrutiny." The presentation theater was a state-of-the-art amphitheater of technology, a darkened space dominated by a massive curved screen displaying the Zenith Tower from every conceivable angle. Blackwell settled into the central chair, flanked by his 2 partners at adjacent stations. A handful of senior designers and the studio manager stood in the back, their faces tense. Dr. Chen entered quietly, taking a position at a small auxiliary console in the corner, the same tablet now docked and displaying supplementary data that only she seemed to monitor. Blackwell, feeling magnanimous in his perceived victory, threw a comment over his shoulder. "Stay and observe, Chen. You might learn something about architecture at this level." The presentation began. The massive screen came to life, showing Blackwell's proposed modifications to the Zenith design. He was undeniably skilled. His suggestions were delivered with fluid confidence, his explanations to his partners crisp and authoritative. For 40 minutes, the review proceeded smoothly. Blackwell proposed changes to the facade, alterations to the support columns, adjustments to the wind bracing system, all presented with textbook precision and backed by conventional engineering wisdom. He was relaxed, confident, even making self-congratulatory remarks. He was performing for the audience, demonstrating his effortless mastery. And then, without warning, everything fell apart. A harsh alarm blared through the theater, and red warning indicators began flashing across every screen. "Critical failure. Critical failure," a synthesized voice announced, cold and mechanical. "Catastrophic wind load event. Primary support columns exceeding stress limits. Cascade failure in structural integrity. Building stability compromised." On the main screen, the holographic Zenith Tower began to buckle. The twisted crystalline structure that had seemed so elegant now revealed its fatal flaw. Under the simulated force of a Category 5 hurricane, a scenario that climate projections deemed increasingly likely, the building's modified support system was failing. The cantilevered sections began to twist beyond their tolerance, stress fractures spiderwebbing across the digital model in terrifying red lines. Blackwell's confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by frantic, defensive energy. "That's not. The wind coefficient must be wrong," he stammered, his hands flying over his control panel. "Recalculate the load distribution. Why isn't the secondary bracing compensating?" His partners were equally panicked, their voices rising as they tried to input corrections, but the simulation was relentless. The designers in the back exchanged knowing looks. This was the architect's nightmare, a secret catastrophic simulation designed by the program's creators to test a designer's response to the unthinkable. The only correct response was to acknowledge the fundamental flaw and redesign from the ground up. Blackwell, his face pale with sweat, his arrogance shattered, stared at the screen where the building was now in full structural collapse, shedding debris and glass in a horrifying cascade. "This is a software glitch," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper. "The model must be corrupted. No one could have anticipated these parameters." He was about to blame the simulation itself, to deflect responsibility in front of everyone he had tried to impress. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable denial, the deflection, the refusal to accept failure. In the corner of the theater, Dr. Chen had not moved. She had not flinched at the alarms, nor had her expression changed at the sight of the catastrophic failure. While Blackwell and his team were consumed by chaos, she remained a pool of absolute stillness. Her eyes, which had been scanning her private readouts, now fixed on the main screen. She saw not a dying building, but a solvable engineering problem. She saw not a collapse, but a set of variables: wind velocity, material stress points, load distribution pathways, and the dormant potential of the structure's adaptive systems. Blackwell's hands were frozen over his keyboard, his pride warring with the undeniable reality of his failure. "It's impossible to fix," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "The design is fundamentally compromised." It was then that Chen's fingers began to move. She didn't touch the main presentation controls. Instead, she began typing a rapid series of commands into her auxiliary console, her movements economical and precise, like a surgeon performing a delicate operation. On her small diagnostic screen, visible only from her position, lines of structural code and engineering calculations scrolled past at dizzying speed. She was rerouting the building's adaptive response systems, redistributing load-bearing responsibilities in real time, activating dormant dampening mechanisms that existed in the original design but had been overlooked in Blackwell's modifications. On the main screen, something impossible happened. Just as the Zenith Tower was about to complete its catastrophic collapse, one section of the adaptive facade shifted. A panel array on the windward side reconfigured, creating an aerodynamic surface that redirected wind flow. Then another section responded, and another. Chen was conducting an orchestra of building systems, using the structure's own adaptive technology to fight the forces tearing it apart. She activated tension cables buried in the core, redistributed weight through auxiliary support columns, and deployed emergency stabilization protocols that existed only in theoretical documentation. The collapse slowed. The terrifying cascade of structural failure began to arrest. The red stress indicators on the screen began to shift to yellow, then to green, section by section. Chen's hands moved across her console with rhythmic precision, orchestrating salvation from disaster. She used the building's own weight as a counterbalance, deployed anchoring systems in a specific sequence, and recalibrated the facade panels to act as windbreaks rather than sails. The room was utterly silent, save for the hum of computers and the sound of Chen's measured keystrokes. Every eye was glued to the screen, watching an impossibility unfold. Blackwell had lowered his hands from his keyboard, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He was watching someone save a building that shouldn't be savable, stabilize a structure without conventional supports, rescue a design without hope. The simulation ran its full course. The hurricane winds continued their assault, but the Zenith Tower now stood firm, swaying slightly, but stable, its adaptive systems working in perfect harmony to dissipate and redirect the destructive forces. Finally, in bright green letters, words appeared on the screen. Structural integrity maintained, design viable, occupant safety assured. The silence in the presentation theater stretched into eternity. It was a heavy, profound quiet, broken only by the gentle whir of cooling computers. The simulation's final message glowed with almost accusatory brightness. No one moved, no one spoke. The design team stared at the screen, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion, as if they had witnessed a fundamental law of physics being rewritten. Blackwell's two partners looked from the screen to their mentor, their faces pale with shock. They had been trained by the best educated at the finest institutions, but what they had just witnessed was not in any textbook. It was something else entirely, a feat of engineering that bordered on the supernatural. Marcus Blackwell remained frozen in his central chair. The swagger, the arrogance, the loud certainty. It had all been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow shell of disbelief. His eyes were fixed on the image of the standing, stable Zenith Tower. "No," he whispered, barely audible. "That's not possible." He turned in his chair, his gaze finally finding Chen in the corner. She was no longer at her console. She stood calmly, disconnecting her tablet, as if she had just completed a routine checklist. "The physics are impossible," Blackwell stammered, his voice cracking. "No one can manually reconfigure adaptive systems with that kind of precision in real time. It's not humanly possible." He was grasping for any explanation that would preserve his worldview, a world where he was the pinnacle of architectural excellence. The door to the theater opened, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Every person in the room straightened to attention. CEO Jonathan Reeves entered, his presence radiating quiet, absolute authority. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, with a face that had witnessed the rise and fall of architectural movements across 5 decades. He didn't acknowledge the respectful nods. His gaze swept the room, taking in the shocked faces, the glowing screen with its impossible message of success, and finally settling on Marcus Blackwell. Reeves walked not to Blackwell, but to the main engineering console. The lead programmer, a man with a doctorate in computational design, seemed to shrink slightly in the CEO's presence. "Pull up the personnel file for Dr. Chen," Reeves said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Authorization, Reeves Alpha 3. The programmer's eyes widened at the authorization code. Alpha 3 was a designation reserved for the company's most protected information. He turned to his keyboard, fingers flying. A moment later, a file appeared on the main screen. Most of it was restricted, vast fields marked confidential, but what was visible was enough to transform the room's atmosphere entirely. Name: Chen, Sarah L. Title, Chief Architect and Director of Structural Innovation Credentials, Ph.D. Structural Engineering, MIT, M.Arch, Harvard GSD, professional experience 24 years. A murmur went through the room. 24 years. Blackwell's own impressive 15-year career suddenly seemed modest. Awards: Pritzker Architecture Prize, youngest recipient, age 34, AIA Gold Medal, Aga Khan Award for Architecture, MacArthur Fellowship. The list continued. Each award represented the highest possible recognition in the field, achievements that defined entire careers. Notable projects: classified Shanghai Adaptive Tower, first building to withstand 8.0 magnitude earthquake with 0 structural damage, classified. Dubai Climate Spire, revolutionary carbon-neutral cooling system, classified. Singapore Vertical Forest, redefined urban ecological integration. Current assignment: lead architect, Zenith Tower project, creator and holder of 47 patents in adaptive structural engineering. The screen showed a final line. Special recognition, pioneered the dynamic load redistribution protocol, now mandatory study at all major architectural schools worldwide. Jonathan Reeves turned from the screen, his movement deliberate. He faced Dr. Chen, who had remained standing quietly by her station. In front of the entire room, the humbled consultant, the shocked partners, the vindicated design team, the CEO extended his hand with profound respect. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice resonating with unmistakable deference. "On behalf of Reeves Architecture Group, I apologize for the unprofessional reception you received today. Your patience, as always, far exceeds what should have been required." Chen shook his hand with a brief, economical motion, her expression unchanged. There was no hint of triumph, no satisfaction at Blackwell's humiliation. There was only the calm, steady focus of a professional who had simply done her job. Reeves turned, his gaze now falling upon Marcus Blackwell like a physical weight. Blackwell had risen from his chair, looking as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. Mr. Blackwell, Reeves began, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. You asked to speak with the lead architect. You've been looking at her for the past hour. You questioned her presence. You mocked her contribution. You assumed that expertise comes packaged in a way that fits your narrow expectations. He took a step closer. Let me tell you who you just insulted. In 2019, the Kuala Lumpur Meridian Tower, a building my company designed, was struck by an unprecedented tropical cyclone during its construction phase. The temporary support systems were failing. Evacuation was impossible for 300 workers trapped inside. Dr. Chen was on site as a consultant. What you witnessed on that screen, the protocol you called impossible, she invented it in real time while coordinating with emergency services and calculating load redistributions on a laptop in the rain while the building swayed 40 feet from its center axis. The room was absolutely silent. She saved 300 lives that day, Reeves continued. They call it the Chen protocol at every major engineering school now. The building stands today as one of the most structurally sound high-rises in Southeast Asia. The technique she developed has been applied to retrofit hundreds of structures worldwide. He let the story settle. The designers, who had known Chen as a quiet, demanding but fair project lead, now looked at her with reverence. Dr. Chen didn't just study at MIT and Harvard, Reeves said, relentless. She teaches there. She has published over 100 peer-reviewed papers. She holds more patents in adaptive engineering than your entire firm combined. She wrote the structural specifications for the Zenith Tower. She designed the simulation you just failed. She is not here to learn from you, Mr. Blackwell. You are here, if you are very, very lucky, to learn from her. You will address her as Dr. Chen or ma'am. You will extend to her the professional courtesy and respect that her credentials and her achievements demand. Is that understood? Blackwell could only manage a choked whisper. Yes, sir. Completely understood. He looked at Dr. Chen, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as support staff or a technician, but as a legend standing before him. And in her calm, unwavering gaze, he saw not anger, but a standard of excellence so high he had never even conceived it existed. The story of what happened in the Zenith Tower presentation theater spread through the architectural community like wildfire. It traveled through professional networks, industry conferences, and university lecture halls. The tale acquired the polished quality of legend with each retelling. They called it the Day of the Silent Architect. Details were embellished. Some said the simulation had thrown multiple natural disasters at her simultaneously, others that she had stabilized the building using only mental calculations. But the core remained unchanged. The quiet woman in the plain sweater had, in the space of 10 minutes, humbled the loudest voice in the room and performed a feat of engineering that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Marcus Blackwell's reputation took a significant hit. For months, his name became synonymous with arrogance checked by reality, but the public embarrassment was secondary to his internal transformation. The incident had burned away his ego, forcing him to confront how little he truly understood. 2 weeks after the incident, Blackwell found Dr. Chen in the company's technical library. She was surrounded by journals on materials science and climate adaptation, still learning, still pushing boundaries. He approached hesitantly, his former confidence completely absent. Dr. Chen, he began, voice quiet and sincere. I wanted to apologize. My conduct was unprofessional and inexcusable. I was arrogant and blind. I'm sorry. Chen looked at him, her expression patient and non-judgmental. What you did in that simulation, he continued, shaking his head. I've reviewed the data dozens of times. I still don't fully comprehend it. I was hoping, if you had time, you might be willing to explain the sequence. I want to learn. He expected rejection, a well-deserved dismissal. Instead, Dr. Chen closed her journal, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. Tuesday, 9 a.m. My office, she said. Bring your questions and an open mind. The first lesson is that the building doesn't care about your reputation. In that simple act of mentorship, she demonstrated the true nature of mastery. It wasn't about being superior to others. It was about elevating everyone around her. Competence wasn't a weapon, but a tool for collective improvement. Blackwell nodded, relief and gratitude washing over him. Yes, ma'am, thank you. The ripple effects extended far beyond one humbled architect. The legend of Dr. Chen became institutionalized. The full data from her impossible stabilization run was shared with architectural schools worldwide. At MIT, Harvard, and the Architectural Association in London, the Chen protocol became mandatory curriculum. Professors would play the recording for rooms full of ambitious students who would watch in stunned silence as the catastrophe unfolded and the miraculous recovery proceeded. The lesson transcended technical details. It became a parable about the nature of true expertise. "Observe her movements," an instructor would say, pausing the video on Chen's hands at the console. "No wasted motion. Look at her biometric data on the side panel. Heart rate barely elevated. That is mastery. It's not loud, it's not showy, it is calm, quiet, and absolute." A framed printout of the Zenith Tower stress analysis during the simulation was mounted in the main hall at MIT's architecture department. It showed chaotic red lines slowly, impossibly resolving into stable green patterns. It hung beside photographs of Frank Lloyd Wright and Zaha Hadid. There was no photo of Chen beside it at her specific request, only a brass plaque. "The Chen protocol. Stability is the difference between collapse and adaptation." Dr. Chen herself remained as elusive as her reputation suggested. She deflected praise, declined media interviews, and avoided award ceremonies. When a young intern, emboldened by the legend, asked how she stayed so calm under pressure, she gave a simple answer. "I don't have time for panic," she said. "Fear is a distraction. In a crisis, there are only two things: the problem and the solution. Focus on the problem, you'll find the solution. Focus on anything else, and you become part of the problem." Her philosophy of quiet competence began reshaping the industry culture. Young architects talked less about awards and recognition, more about precision, understanding, and responsibility. The loudest voices in design reviews were no longer the most respected. People started paying attention to the quiet ones, the observers, wondering what hidden depths they might possess. A year passed. The Zenith Tower, under Dr. Chen's continued guidance, had moved from design to construction, implementing innovations that were already being studied by engineers worldwide. She remained a figure of immense respect, a living embodiment of excellence, though she was rarely seen outside her project work. The most significant legacy wasn't in the building itself, but in the transformed attitudes of those who had learned from her example. Marcus Blackwell stood before a conference room full of junior architects at his firm, young designers fresh from graduate school, brimming with the same unchecked confidence he once possessed. But Blackwell was a different man. The flashy designer suits were gone, replaced by practical work clothes. His voice was calmer, his posture less aggressive, his eyes more observant. He was briefing them on a complex urban redevelopment project. He clicked a button, and the screen behind him changed to show the stress analysis printout from the Chen protocol. "Before we discuss design proposals," Blackwell said, his voice steady, "we're going to discuss humility. We're going to talk about the most dangerous thing you bring to any project. It's not an inexperienced client or a tight budget. It's your ego." He told them the story. He didn't spare himself, recounting his arrogance, his dismissive words, his complete failure in the simulation. He described the quiet woman in the plain sweater whom he'd dismissed as support staff, and the impossible feat of engineering she had performed. He recounted the deafening silence of the theater, the weight of the CEO's disappointment, the life-altering lesson he'd learned. "I assumed I knew what excellence looked like," Blackwell told the rapt audience. "I thought it was loud and celebrated and impressive. I was wrong. Excellence was quiet, it was focused, it was standing in the corner doing the work while everyone else was performing. The most skilled person I've ever met never once told me how good she was. She simply showed me." When you're working on a project, check your assumptions. He looked around the room, meeting each young architect's eyes. The quietest person in the meeting might have the answer. The unassuming engineer who raises a concern might be saving the project. Listen more than you speak. Respect the work, not the reputation. Competence is the only currency that matters when lives depend on what we build. That is the lesson Dr. Chen taught me. It's the most important lesson you'll ever learn. He had become the carrier of her legacy, spreading her philosophy to the next generation.